Hey, good evening. How's
Hello.
everyone doing?
Good.
Good. I'm going to admit that I had a little heart attack tonight when I was looking at the agenda and saw on the website that there was an agenda for PNZ. I was like, wait, I thought we canceled that, and then realized that it said it was canceled. So we can talk UDC all night, Chris.
All right, I'm ready.
All right, well, let's hold off. I guess Nancy or Brian, are we waiting on any others, or maybe give it another minute?
Brian, that's your call. Since we don't have a chair for this committee, so I think it's up to Chris and Brian when they would like to start.
Sorry, I'm okay if y'all want to go ahead and get started. Do we have public comment for this?
So I think we're supposed to start there.
Yes. So hold on, just give me 1 second because I got to get back where I can see everybody. So yes, this is the time on the agenda where the public can address the committee. And just to let our two folks in our audience know that the committee members and staff will not engage in a dialogue or answer questions. And if you have questions or comments, you can certainly email them to the address that's included on the meeting agenda. So I see Cynthia is in the meeting. Did you wish to address the committee, Cynthia? If so, please unmute.
Actually, I had emailed my questions earlier.
Okay. Very good. Give me 1 second. Jeanette, I need to bring in another committee member. Okay, Jeanette, did you wish to address the commission, or excuse me, the committee? This isn't the Planning Commission, this is the UDC Steering Committee.
Yes, I would, if you don't mind.
Hey, no, give me just 1 second. You'll have 3 minutes. I just need to set the timer. And then I will let you know when your time begins. Okay, go ahead.
Good, thank you. I haven't really prepared a 3-minute speech, but I just wanted to say that I'm glad to see that there's been some wiggle room happening during the city council meetings. I went to the study session on the 13th and I saw that council was looking at lowering the bulk plane height so that single family homes in the area, which are ranch homes, could be matched by in height with whatever is built. I hope that this committee will be able to somehow figure out a way for that to be feasible. I also heard in the meeting on the 13th that council is considering putting up or allowing one multi-family unit to be built every 3 years. I'll also be interested in hearing if y'all think that will be feasible and how that's going to be presented at the next meeting. I know you're going to have time to think about that between now and then. And I'm also glad that this didn't go straight to the PNZ, because clearly there's a lot more thinking to be done. And there is certainly plenty of public input, positive and negative, about this project. I'm kind of neutral in one way, but it does depend on how this comes out. I live in a ranch home, and I would be really, really sad, just sad, and of course upset, but sad more than anything, to see the character of our neighborhood changed. I don't mind the idea of row homes if they are the same height as the rest of the homes in the neighborhood. I think that would be the least intrusive. So those are my thoughts, and I'll be interested in seeing what happens in this meeting as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeanette. And then I have one other person at the time. Sandra, did you wish to speak to the committee? If so, please unmute. Sandra, can you hear me? I see that you're off mute, but we can't hear you. At least I can't. Let me try one more time. Sandra, did you want to address the committee for 3 minutes? Okay. That's the only public we have. So I think we're good to move on.
And maybe before Chris, you get started, or Brian, obviously there's a few people in the public tonight. There's been a lot of people. If you haven't been watching the council meetings, there's quite a bit of interest in this UDC update. And, I think we've all been taking it very seriously, but I think there's a lot of discussions that still need to happen, make sure that we're all on the same page and presenting forward what's going to end up going in front of plan and zoning, and then basically to council. Ultimately, they're going to have the final say in it, but I think a lot of what we're going to decide here is going to be really important. And we appreciated Chris's guidance and staff's help on all this also, but really need to make sure that we're engaged as possible and making sure that we're kind of making the right decisions for the city, because this is going to be an important step moving forward. So if you guys hadn't seen that, I know Carl's been there for a couple times, and I know Brenda's mentioned it, but if you hadn't noticed, there's been some more excitement about the UDC than I would have thought there would have been. So it's interesting to see. So thank you.
I think I said in our last P and Z, we're in for a heck of a ride, Colin, and I was referring to that. So yeah.
I don't have a hand raise here, so I'm gonna just barge in. What is the time frame for UDC to finish up and it goes to planning and zoning? And how much time will planning and zoning have to work on?
So right now, we still don't have a time frame. We are still working through some items with council. I don't know if Chris is going to touch on this, but they brought up at the meeting on last Monday an idea to separate out the housing parts of the housing discussion and then take the remaining UDC forward. So we need to decide if that's going to be a solidified idea, and then we can start working on a time frame of, you know, whether the remaining UDC items go as one package and some of the housing discussion goes as a separate one. So I think we're kind of working through logistics of that and what that might look like, especially from Chris's end, trying to, you know, write that code and write that kind of draft. So once we get, you know, that information, I think we'll be a little bit further down the road. And Chris may be able to provide some timeline on, you know, where they're at with updating the initial drafts that you all seen, to getting some more finalized draft products. But I'll turn it over to Chris and let him kind of go through his piece, and then maybe we'll have some more answers to some of your questions by the time he's done.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, I'll hit on all of that, and basically try and break that out so that it's pretty clear, the key decisions that both the general public, those in the audience tonight, and you as a committee, the planning commission and council are focusing on, because we think we have a really good approach to break down a lot of related questions and options, mainly because of the work you guys have all put in early. So I'm gonna tonight give more of a bigger, like last meeting or 2 meetings ago, I guess, when I was with you, we gave kind of the introduction to the full code for the first time, especially for those new members. This one will circle back and focus mainly on revisiting the housing issues, and then also provide those updates with what the council has been discussing and directing, what's been, at least in our mind, directed to us, and what remains undecided. And then, as Brian mentioned, the parts that we do foresee breaking out as this moves through the adoption process. So let me get my slideshow started here. Okay. So just kind of orient us back into the overall code. Most of the changes we're doing has been moving elements of your current code from the left side of the screen more towards the right. So that three-dimensional design-based, form-based approach to development, because those are the things that impact most of all how things fit into the community. And housing also being a big part of that. Housing, as you'll see as we go through this, can benefit from some of those strategies as well. So we're focusing less on the zoning districts and the uses specifically, although not ignoring them altogether. The districts are still important filters, as you'll see tonight. And we are using those districts to kind of break things by scale and intensity more than we are uses. And then elevating some of the current standards that you already have with regard to form and design, but just coordinating them a little better with your comprehensive plan. So in the housing standpoint, the use idea is thinking things less of single family, multifamily, and thinking them more as building types, you know, the things that give the building a three-dimensional scale. And then when we layer in the housing attainability discussions that are going on as part of that separate study that Root policy is adding to this, that meshes with the comp plan, it also gives us a filter to here's what we can do within that framework with housing attainability. So in all districts, we're providing a general mix of different types, which will allow different size and different types of units to be built. Although in some districts that mix is greater than in others, and we'll focus on that tonight. In some cases, considering allowing additional types that aren't allowed in that district generally, but allow them if they provide an assurance of an affordable unit contractually, in other words, an obligation to keep it affordable. Similarly, if they agree to that, adding some parking reductions in all of the districts. And then lastly, in the MU districts, the mixed use R3, and then also the general mixed use districts, adding a height bonus if they're guaranteeing affordability. And those are all things that Root's been instrumental in helping us tweak and make sure these things are viable, but yet within bounds of the community's desires for development. So I'll hit on some of those throughout the night as well. Overall, this has been our approach to housing. I mentioned less on use and more on building types. So the council work sessions, they've addressed this topic now 4 different times, each time getting a little more refined and nuanced. And so there are some changes to these types since this committee last saw it, and even since we gave the broader overview a month ago that I want to focus on as well. So here's where the residential building type table stands right now. And I'll focus on the things that we think have changed based on those 4 work sessions. And not all of them are reflected on this table, incidentally. As Brian mentioned, it's kind of a work in progress, and we're evaluating which things we want to make sure when we edit it, we're doing it in a comprehensive way and not doing it piecemeal and losing track of things. So we try to wait till we get all the input and then kind of go back and redo the draft. But the couple of the big changes to note is on these small lot houses. So detached house, so it's still a single unit building type, and the smaller lots, the ones that are indicated as L. If you recall, those were the ones that are currently allowed in your development code right now. But they're different sizes based on which zoning district you're in. And then they're also just grandfathered in. So if it existed, it can stay. So it doesn't really add anything as far as new development. It's just kind of giving the rights that were already there from smaller lots. So the strategy we discussed with this committee was, well, let's enable some of those in the patterns and locations where we see them occur. And so it's usually corner lots or ingrained of the block, an alley adjacent lot. You'll often see a smaller lot carved off, and then allowing them through the courtyard pattern as well that we've discussed. And so those are what the L's mean, that they're allowed based on location limits. Based on the discussion of the 2 to 4 unit buildings and considering those in single in the R1 districts, we went ahead and added the smallest lot in both of those as a condition. The rationale there was, well, since we're already considering allowing multi-unit buildings at a similar density, we might as well allow the smallest lot in all of the R1 districts. And some of the reasons for that will come out through this presentation. But then in doing so, also, we brought the lot size down based on staff's recommendation from 3,000, which is where your current code is, to 2.5 thousand square feet. That has to do with some of the dividing patterns of those corner lots and some of the existing lots in your block structure, but it gives a little more flexibility for those types of projects. Another change that we foresee from this table, it was the accessory dwelling units. If you recall, this committee initiated the discussion of, hey, on the larger lots, why not allow multiple units? And so I think had it at this medium lot, the 7,200 square foot lot, which equates to your minimum R1B right now under the current code. We brought that down to 6,000 square feet to have an additional accessory unit. And I'll talk about that more specifically, but that was under a similar rationale as the previous one. Other than that, there's not any largely significant changes to this table from when you last saw it. The one thing that's not reflected here that we do see making the change is based on that discussion that was brought up in the public comment on the row houses. And what we see doing is kind of repurposing this small lot row house for a couple of reasons. One, to get a smaller scale building type that would even be more appropriate in the R2 district here, where you see it first being allowed. But if the community is considering allowing those in R1 districts based on some affordability, contractual obligations. The discussion was, let's not allow it with this many attached units. Let's make sure it's a smaller scale building, cap the units at 4. And then we're going ahead and suggesting that that should probably also be a 2-story building for reasons that deal with the bulk plane as well. So we're thinking of converting the row house to a, and rather than small lot and large lot, which sort of the large lot one reflects your current standard of 3,000 square feet per unit, which, let me back up a minute. I guess the reason we suggested changing that was we think that's one of the reasons your row houses that you're getting are looking larger scale than necessary. There's a large lot requirement to get that unit. And so then people are maximizing it with the building envelope. And so you're seeing bigger buildings. So kind of counterintuitively, if we reduce that per unit minimum lot size down, we're liable to get smaller buildings. And so we now, with how the discussions evolved, we're going to go ahead and put some caps to ensure that it's even a smaller scale building. In doing that, we're thinking it won't be the lot size that we adjust and just make the building type. So the large row house would then become, it may still allow a lesser per unit lot size, but more attached units and then a higher building height. So we would literally have 2 different scales of buildings, and then it will be easier to filter which districts either one is appropriate in. So that's just more of a heads up of things we think changing with this table. But it's also an example of how this table can be used to kind of tailor and tweak things as we go forward.
Hey, Chris, we've got a couple of questions. Do you want to finish through this slide, or would you like to
Yeah,
take
I'm
those now?
ready to move on to the next slide, so we can
Oh,
go ahead and take
perfect.
some questions. Yeah.
Okay, Michelle?
Sorry, I wasn't prepared to unmute that fast. Thanks so much, Chris. Can you explain that column accessory, like on the detached house, large lot, principal 1, accessory 2? Does that mean you could put you could allow 2 ADUs on that lot, including the principal house?
Yes, that is correct. I'll get to that in a minute, but because that's evolved since you last discussed it, and it's evolved in 2 ways. One, several ways, but 2 most significant ways. The one is bringing that minimum lot size down. The last time you all saw this, this column here with the 6,000 square foot lot was 1. So now it's 2. So this is meaning just what you said, that those detached house lots of this size or larger can have that principal unit and then up to 2 accessory units. One of the other things that's changed is when we do that, we are requiring that if you do that, one of the accessory units needs to at least be an attached, so within the existing building. So you wouldn't have an extra outbuilding necessarily. And so you would be resulting in the same or similar scale development is the idea behind that.
Okay. And ADUs is not just about a building, it's about a whole host of other things, as we are all very well aware of. So it used to be just one ADU that was allowed for those first 3 lines? Is that what was there before?
In this group's draft, it was the 2s were just in the first 2. If you're asking what's currently allowed, it would actually just be the R1C. So it would just be this district, although it could technically be a 1 for a 6,000 square foot lot, because that's what was required. So the current standard would have a 1 there for all of them, but it would only be in the R1C district currently. Back to the last draft that was proposed, it was 2 for these 2, and it was all 3 of these districts being eligible. Okay, so if I'm just make sure that I'm understanding correctly. So previously the ADUs were only allowed when you got to R1C. Is that correct? That's correct. And now this reflects that we're going to change it and allow them, and not only allow them, but they could have up to 2, although 1 may have to be attached to the principal residence. Am I getting all this correct? That's exactly correct. Yes. Okay. All right. And then is there any requirement for one of the owners to be a resident in any of these districts? Yeah. So those are some of the changes that have kind of been discussed. I have a more comprehensive slide on ADUs that'll get to some of that. I'll stop then. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, and then we have Andy.
Yeah, thanks. I know we've gone back and forth on this a couple times talking about the lot area minimum per unit. What is the rationale for keeping that in there when we already have the number of units restricted and there's a minimum lot width needed? Do we still need that minimum per unit?
Yeah, good question. I think on the multi-unit buildings, the ones that are clearly an apartment building, I don't think you do. And in fact, we've kind of been pushing towards reducing that in a number of places where you currently have it and sort of eliminating it and letting the building scale handle it. Essentially what happens there is the parking on those sites is going to dictate how many units you can get. That will be the more challenging thing than any minimum per unit lot area, I think, when you get into the 5+ unit buildings. I do think for the row houses and the multi-unit house, there is some value in keeping it because there is a certain pattern and lot structure to those building types. But it's certainly not a given that it would have to be that way.
And then Colin?
Sorry, I thought I had pushed the wrong button there. A lot of the conversation that's happened the last few nights has been about additional units in the R1 neighborhoods, and I'm not seeing that showing
Right.
here. Are you saying that that's then not part of the recommendation, or is that going to be later discussed?
That's later discussed. And so 2 reasons for that, just kind of jumping ahead of a preview. That's going to be our strategy to break these into 2 issues, as Brian mentioned, because however that issue is resolved through the continuing discussion and the council direction and your all's input, is it's some type of symbol that goes in this area for how and where they're enabled. So we're kind of waiting till we get it. That's still an open question in our mind. And I think with the council, they're going to revisit this next month and sort of give final direction. But then even going forward, there would be a way to break this into 2 different approvals. The second reason is those are really only going to be allowed if it's going to be people that opt in to an affordability contract. In other words, at least one of the units will be made affordable by contractual obligation through the legal and administrative mechanisms we determine. So when we do that, there will be a question. There's a separate section of the code that addresses that. And the question will be, does the table need to reflect this? Or how do we tie, what kind of symbolism do we use in the table to tie to that specific section? Because it won't just be a check the box as these other building types are allowed. These are the types we were just saying they could and should be built anywhere based on this table. So there would be, at the very least, there would be some different symbol that links back to that section that says these are only allowed in these limited circumstances.
And I think you said it, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding. You're going to have council direct you first on that before we really get into a deep dive on that discussion.
Correct. That was part of the discussion at the last work session was, well, they've batted around a few ideas, which I'm going to present to you tonight. Why don't we just send it to Planning Commission and see what they think? However, they're going to address it one more time and try to put a finer point on it. But tonight's meeting is to clue you guys in onto some of the ideas and options they're having as well.
All right, thank you.
Chris, this is Carl. With the what you're talking about is they're going to put 1 unit as a percentage of the AMI. Is that correct?
Correct.
How are they going to do that with the AMI is variable. It goes all over the place. How are you going to do that into the code?
Yeah, good question. What we're working with Root on is to say we codify the requirement that has to be affordable based on a well understood definition, and it's going to be those percentages of AMI. However, what we want to codify, what we're working on kind of behind the scenes is let's codify it to a specific housing policy that gets updated. And then that could have the annual updates to where the area median income is, because it will, what was really brought up at the last meeting was there's two issues going on for that, specifically for Inglewood. One is that the area median income includes more than you all. The second is that your incomes are lower than the area median income as a whole of your residents. So there's a sort of a double issue to be addressed with this affordability component. The price point is going to be based on an area median income that includes a larger area. And what Root analyzed was that Inglewood's incomes tend to be slightly below that in general. But it will be, to your original question, we're working on something that it would be, the code would pin it to the policy, and the policy could be updated annually to reflect the latest and most accurate numbers.
Okay, you can go ahead. No more questions right now. Thanks, Chris.
So first set of questions will be based on that table. What are we doing in the R1 districts with respect to there's two things going on here. The one is just providing housing options based on your planning policies to say that that's what makes good neighborhoods. That's what builds a resilient Inglewood. That's what makes walkable communities. That's what gives us options, having different housing types in these districts. And then the second component underlying it is, what does that do to the affordability and attainability policies? So I'm going to run through each of the groups of districts, pointing the changes we're making out. And most of these first sets are ones that we think are pretty well vetted by both you all and the council. So we think we have enough direction to bring these to the final code right now. There's just some associated changes that we want to make sure we have done, so it all comes as a complete and integrated approach. But these are the areas that are zoned R1, A, B, and C. A being the least intensive, B being a moderate intensive, and C being most intensive of the R1 districts. R1 meaning it's primarily based on one unit building types, a detached house, often called single family. So the first big intervention of what's changing from your current code are these series of things. So we kind of touched on them a little bit, but accessory dwelling units. So the changes that will occur will be expanding it into R1, A, and B, which it currently isn't now. Allow an internal ADU, so either an attached unit, an attic apartment, or basement apartment, are the things you commonly find. So something that's within the building envelope of an existing home or added to it. And then that brings in the option for the two, allowing two if one is attached. One of the things that hasn't been in the draft is simplifying the scale element. So right now there's I believe it's a 75% of the unit, or I'm sorry, it's a 650 square foot max, up to 100% of the unit. We played with the idea, since that could be a little bit limiting, we played with the idea of allowing up to 800 square feet, but then bringing the percentage down, because we truly want to make sure it's accessory to the unit and not just a second unit. And we had a question on that at council 3 weeks ago. But essentially where we think we're landing, and I think it was brought up first by one of the individuals on this committee, I apologize, I can't remember who, but some really good practical things about, sometimes that's a moving target, and then having two competing standards may not be the best. Anyway, long story short, we think we're going to land on, let's just make that accessory unit a maximum of 800 square feet. Then it's a known quantity in every situation. And then we can deal with assuring that it truly is accessory. In other words, subordinate incidental may not always be smaller, but not as evident that it's a 2-unit building or a 2-building site. That's the big interest of the question we face at council is, well, are we automatically turning everything into a duplex by allowing an internal unit and an additional accessory unit? And the answer to that is no. We need to make sure there's other standards that ensure that it's a subordinate and less prominent unit. So anyway, so the site appears as it would now. That's the goal. The E is the next bigger one of removing the additional parking requirement. I think when we were last with you all, we were going to keep that. A lot of that came from public sentiment of, hey, we're okay with this idea, and we're okay with even multiple as long as there's not a parking impact. However, council's direction was, let's remove that. requirement altogether. We were considering letting the staff have an administrative waiver if there was situations there was plenty of on-street parking, or if they were in a transit served area or something like that, some other factors. However, council's direction was this is something that's a commonly mentioned impediment to that, so let's just remove the parking. And similarly to F, the council's direction was remove the owner occupancy requirement as well. The last thing that I have on there is something that was added back in that Brian, you might be able to correct me. I don't think we got official direction, or we may have that. There was a discussion of, well, let's at least let this keep the requirement, but have it sunset after 10 years so that at least the people that are initially building it are building it so it can be accessory to them owning a unit, and it's not a multi-unit rental property. Even though that brings the whole rental issue kind of brings up a question of there's homes right now that you have that could be rental. There's nothing that the development code can do to prevent rental of property. It's only when you're adding in this additional option that that owner occupancy kind of comes in. So that one I believe is still in flux, or I think the council was tending to want to remove that requirement. I'll pause there with any questions or additions, Brian, you might have.
Brenda?
Oh, did Brian have any additions though before I ask questions?
No, Brenda, go ahead.
Oh, my first question, it probably has to do with the scale. Did we remove that requirement that it must be, the accessory must be in the rear 32%? I think that's how it was worded. Does that sound familiar?
It does sound familiar. I don't know if it's familiar because it's in your current standard in what we're proposing, but the one thing we are trying to do is to sort of separate the ability to have a unit with the accessory building itself. So the accessory building, regardless of whether you have a unit in it or not, we want to make sure that's scaled appropriately to the lot. And so that usually means it's in the rear portion. So that would be for the detached one. That's what we will be looking to ensure. The one exception to that would be, I think, garages, and then garages with a accessory unit above it, we would have a differing height standard. Other than that, though, we would want the detached unit to be under the same accessory building standards as would any kind of secondary building, whether it's a garage, a workshop, an office, or something like that, simply because we want the standards to be scaling those appropriately to your detached house lots.
Yeah, so just a quick follow-up for Brian. You're probably aware of it. I had to go get a variance because I conformed my existing garage that was built before, the year 2000. And because it was just all the garages line up except for mine was just a little bit further in towards the property. It was like by 4 feet. And there was thought among community development, and so maybe others, maybe council would be open to this, removing this. It's just an odd setback. Like, I got the variance, it's not a big deal. It really wasn't. I think it maybe just, it's not the biggest impediment to homes. But I was wondering if, I don't know if there's a flavor. Sorry, this is kind of a second question. What would the flavor be with council or community development or building, probably building, if we allowed like modular homes to be built instead of stick built? And on the lower end.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that on two levels. We multi-studio, we typically approach that issue of modular is great and fine, and the code might even be silent to it. So in other words, as long as it meets whatever standards any building would meet in terms of building code and the design of it, then the modular construction technique should be allowed. The second place we've addressed it, which will come up later in this meeting, people often equate modular to the old school mobile home or a trailer type home, which it can be, but it can also be many other things. you have a current provision for allowing those types of projects that are not just your single lot, but a project of those types of homes. And so we have capitalized on that current element that you have in your code, and you have these places within your community, and trying to kind of elevate and improve those in terms of adding housing options as well. So that's a later slide from that larger question. I kind of interpreting your question of, if you had a detached accessory building, could it be modular? My reply would be yes, as long as it met the building code and met whatever design standards we had.
And Brenda, I can comment on the first item that you mentioned. It doesn't look like the 35%, the requirement to have the unit in the rear 35% was carried over in the draft. The language has changed to, talk about the unit being subordinate to the principal unit, the unit being on the side or rear. It talks about where the entrances should be located. So it does a similar thing, just differently. But I think that might help people out, especially with existing structures. Especially because, we also have the allowance to do internal ADUs, and most of the homes are not at the rear 35%. So it's kind of counterproductive to have that requirement if we're going to allow internal ADUs, or at least that's my perspective. Chris probably thought about that when he was, drafting all this information, but I just wanted to get you an update on what was in the current draft. The only thing that is in there was that the parking space would have to be located in the rear 35%, but as council has requested that requirement go away, so that rear 35% for a parking space would likely end up going away as well.
Okay, then we have Noel.
I guess you just answered my question about 30 seconds ago. I was going to talk about how putting an ADU on top of a garage kind of sticks out more, but putting an ADU next to a garage is very difficult if it has to be on the back of the lot. But I'm happy to hear that should no longer be the case.
Okay, thank you. And Colin?
I also wanted to note that I wouldn't be surprised if we have a lot of homes that are 800 square feet. Relatively speaking, 800 to 1,000 on the main level. So I don't know if that is a challenge with saying the ADU has to be accessory to it if the main house, if that stays, is only 800 square feet. As one thought. And then second thought, I know at least, kind of around where I live, that several houses that appear to have been built in the back of the lot, or maybe they had a house in the front and they built, an ADU at one point and the house in front got torn down. So would that preclude them then from being able to add a unit, or would the back unit be able to be the ADU and the front unit be able to be like the main unit or something like that?
Yeah, I think to your first question, I think one of the reasons that was brought up at this committee first was, the principal unit may be in flux, or in some cases may not even be there, or it may be added to. So the idea of having it as a percentage of the unit sometimes competed against that. So that's where I got to the point of the point I made earlier was, let's say it is an 800 square foot ADU and it's an 800 square foot home. There are other standards we can do to make sure it still appears accessory to that unit. And so that's what we're kind of double checking, because I think the consensus and direction was, let's not have competing standards. Let's just have one. And that way the sites can be a little bit more adaptable. I don't know. I don't think I fully understand the circumstance you're bringing up for that second question of what that might mean to an existing situation.
I guess if a house was built at the back of the lots for whatever reason, could they put a primary house in the front and then the back would be the ADU?
I see. Okay. Right. The existing home actually ends up becoming the accessory unit due to what they built on the front of the lot. I think that's possible in some circumstances. I can't say that any come to the top of my mind from going around your community, but I think we want to end up to where we are comfortable with the build out of the lots in all the R1 districts. We want to be comfortable with it and then give people options of how to fit within those parameters.
Kate?
I have what might be a very basic question. So, and I'm looking back at the areas the minimum lot areas. So right now, do we not have any lots in R1A that are 77,200 square feet or 6,000 square feet?
Oh, yeah, good question. So that, the answer is probably no. And that what we're going to have to do is we'll have to circle back wherever we end up on those smaller lots. They're kind of set up to be mutually exclusive, but when you look at it, it's really a minimum. So if your minimum ends up being 4,000 or 2,500 square feet, in that, we know that, well, it could be greater than that because that's a minimum. So you could get some in that 6,000 to 7,200 if they're meeting those location criteria. There could also be plenty of lots that are pre-existing. So they've been platted and they're non-conforming, and so they may not exist in those specific locations where they're enabling them. So we would treat them separately. They would be buildable lots due to your non-conforming provisions. But that backs us up to the original point, is the R1A minimum standard is staying true to your current code of what it allows. It allows what it allows is it actually allows a 9,000 square feet minimum, but it allows a 4,500 square feet minimum if you're already existing. When we approach the idea of, well, let's allow these smaller lots to be created anew under certain circumstances, we merge the 4,500 and the 4,000 into a single lot and building type, and that was combining R1A and B. But I think if the other question is, would we want to just be platting and building 6,000 and 7,000 square foot lots everywhere in R1A? I think the answer would probably be no, at least in my mind, because it's based on this pre-established pattern of larger lots.
And just another clarification, the pre-established pattern is just because of the number we picked at whatever time, we as in the city of Inglewood.
True. Yes.
There's not a quality of life measure that goes along with 9,000 square foot lot.
Okay, I don't see any other hands,
Any other
Chris.
question? Okay, we'll move on to this, and that's a good segue actually into the second issue on the R1 districts. So it's allowing the smaller lots. So here they are, and just as I had mentioned earlier, what we're calling the urban lot stems from a current requirement for 3,000 square feet, which is in the R1C. So based on the direction that this conversation has taken with other building types, and then the idea that, well, if these are location limited to the corners or alley adjacent in grain, that's a term we've been using that has some questions on what does it mean, but it essentially means the shorter end of your blocks. And you often see it in your existing areas where someone might have cut off the back portion of their lot adjacent to the alley, fit a home in that orients to that short end of the block. So that's what we're talking about here. And so we do think that reducing it to 2,000 square feet or 2,500 square feet, and then allowing that same one in all three of the districts has some benefits. In doing that, we would also, I think this was brought up the last time it was before this committee, there was some discussion on, in those situations or in the courtyard pattern, there's a building type that's kind of becoming more common throughout the Front Range and in the Denver metro of what's called a tall skinny. And so reducing the building height, the other advantage of calling this out as a separate type is we can reduce the building height. It's not appearing in this table, but we've gone ahead and done that to make sure it's a 2-story building. So it's reflective of those smaller buildings that you have in your community already, most of which are even 1-story, but certainly not allowing the 32-foot height limit, which is what all of the R1 standards are based on. Some of the benefits that we do want to point out, because they help to the broader question of, what are we doing across all of these zoning districts? Essentially, when we brought that lot size down, what we realized is we're really getting the same or a similar yield to the whole issue of allowing a 2 to 4 unit building type as well. So we did some models of where on most of those you can get 3 lots. or at the very least, at least 2. And maybe sometimes in some configurations, if you have a deeper corner lot, you could maybe get 4 lots out of that. And so a lot is a unit in this case. It ensures a smaller scale building than if all 4 of those units were grouped into one building. So 4 smaller scale buildings rather than one larger 4-unit building. And then the lot pattern, a building on its lot, it increases the potential that that would also be an owner occupancy, whereas in a 4-unit building, some of those affordable units, it becomes difficult to allow ownership because they're not on a separate platted lot. And so any ownership opportunity in those building types has to be through a condominium, which has some challenges in Colorado due to other laws that we don't necessarily need to get into, but I'm sure some of you are very familiar with. So anyway, this idea of let's take advantage of that small lot pattern seemed to have a lot of corollary benefits to the bigger things we're trying to accomplish in your neighborhoods. And I'll pause there with any further questions on the small lot options.
I'm not seeing any hands.
All right. So now moving into, oh, whoops, I forgot. Lastly, to wrap up that, the affordability implications. As of yet, with those options, none of those really come with an affordability bonus, and nor is there any requirement to do them affordable. However, they can yield what Root has called natural affordability. By having diverse building types and sizes and price points, you can start to see different prices emerge over time. That doesn't mean they would hit any particular AMI, and in fact, some of these that are done quite nicely, and even the ADUs, I think that people are familiar with, can be expensive. They're not going to be the least expensive home, especially if it's being built new. However, it's broadening price ranges, which is always a good thing when trying to tackle affordability. Yes, question.
Yep, Noel, go ahead.
Just in terms of the chart, I'd love to see it broken into under number of units, principal, attached accessory, and detached accessory. Because when I look down and see that, detached house, small lot, 4K area can have an accessory dwelling unit, my brain immediately goes to how exactly would you do that? But I assume that that's talking about an attached one.
Yes, I think that's probably a safe assumption. Although I wouldn't necessarily preclude it. We have seen those size lots with an outbuilding, and accessory units can be quite small. Sometimes people can get them in a 250 to 300 square foot unit for a studio. So I think being open to it being either might scale with that lot, but we can certainly take a different look at it. And again, that goes back to the point of if they're making that choice, there's lot coverage standards, right? So the more you've used up in your principal unit is the less you can use in a detached building. So if they were to make the math work on that small lot, that principal building is going to have to be smaller as well, just by simply of the setbacks and lot coverage standards.
And I'm a believer in the more options, the merrier, just in terms of readability of this table is what I was thinking.
Yes, excellent point. We'll make note of that.
I think
All
you're
right.
good.
Moving into the R2 districts. So these are districts that are already planned for and codified today for multi-unit building types, R2A and B. The difference being R2A is duplex only, and R2B goes up to 4-unit buildings. The one thing I should say is these areas do have, I don't know all of them very well, but when you go through these areas and when you go through the MUR3 districts that we'll talk about in a moment, a lot of times they're predominantly single family homes, and a lot of times they're predominantly low scale, so single story homes. So there's situations right now where these areas are zoned for much larger scale development. So that's just like kind of an FYI as we talk about these. We often talk about this as being, well, it's the districts that's already zoned for that. But again, development in these areas will cause some changes that we need to be aware of. So with that, one of our first elements to do was to look at reducing that per unit minimum to and to the point of perhaps even eliminating it might be a valid point as well. However, what we wanted to do was not have it be too large. And then as a minimum, it led to a larger land area, larger building envelope. And then when you start attaching units, the buildings become much larger. So by reducing it, we think we can get a smaller scale building. And then the most recent direction I mentioned was, well, let's take advantage of that with the small lot row house and the large lot row house and really emphasize that by having one be a 2-story up to 4 units, which would be more appropriate in the R2A, and then a 3-story up to larger units that could be in the R2B. The other addition that we think is important is having a lot maximum. And so this kind of goes to the idea of the widths. We're doing some kind of math here, and we do have some double places to catch this, but the maximum width of the lot and then the maximum area, what we're trying to do is prevent people from, yeah, I met the minimum and check my box because isn't that great? That's what you wanted. And I met it by a lot and it's really big. So, well, that will lead to a larger scale building. So we felt capping the lot sizes could close some of those inadvertent loopholes of yielding really large scale buildings in these areas. We still want them to be very neighborhood scale to mix in well with the fabric of single family homes. It's a little bit tough to do that for sure. And you all have deep experience in doing that with the bulk plane and all that. But this is at least one strategy by reducing those lot sizes for the multi-unit house and the row house building type. One of the things that was then brought up based on the affordability discussion, which we see changing from this table, is instead of having location limits like we did with the smaller lots, so this would signal that these building types are only allowed on the corners of the end grain, really removing that and saying those building types are only allowed if they provide an affordability component. And then they would be allowed anywhere because we'd be ensuring that they, due to the building scale, they do fit in with the fabric. So that's one of the options that is kind of in the air that's back in staff's court to come up with a plan of action for that. I'll hit the next one since it's so related, because the other point we saw to do was to take that to break your what was considered a multi-unit building. The current code says anything over a certain number of units is multi-unit, and therefore it could be small or large. It doesn't really distinguish, and so we broke it into 2 distinct ones. One being a very small building, 3-story maximum lot size that would fit into these multi-family or multi-unit districts more easily, and the other being the large apartment complex that we're more familiar with, providing kind of like a critical mass of housing units. So with that small scale building, the idea was, well, maybe that can fit in the R2B as well. Similar to the row homes and multi-unit house I was mentioning, I think the direction based on the discussion is let's not location limit it, but let's allow it in this district only if it provides an affordability component to it. This is one of the ones that Root policy is looking at, whether those are feasible types, this and the multi-unit house. And so far, they're, and what I mean by feasible is that if you give them the parking reduction and if you give them perhaps a height bonus on this apartment building, would someone be able to build it under today's market without the city having to provide any kind of financial incentive or tax break? And their indication is, yes, it will be technically possible under those market conditions for people to do that and still be profitable. So that's one of the things we're playing with on those building types. And I'll just jump to the affordability implications there. So again, by allowing the range of housing types in these districts, we're going to have even more diversity than we had in the R1 districts. So that's a positive. And then the option for guaranteed affordability, this gets to that point that was brought up earlier. What is that? It's being defined as 100% AMI if it's owner occupied. And so that's a person making 100% or the actual median of the entire area and income would then only be spending 30% of their income on a mortgage. And then the rental one is 80% AMI. So a person making 80% of the median income would only spend 30% of their income on rent. And so those two targets are mirroring some state policy goals to determine what is affordable. With that, we're also the biggest one that Root's instructing us on is parking is the key to these. So having a reduced parking rate does drive some of these smaller format, more compact building types to be more viable, not having to provide that parking. Most of these, the small apartment is the exception, but most of these are in situations where they would likely provide some on-site parking through, whether it's driveways, parking pads, meeting some of our site design standards, or whether it's internal or in a garage, but they probably wouldn't be able to provide all of the parking. And so even if these units come with the typical car yield, our thinking is that the on-street parking for this small number of units is going to probably balance a lot of that out. Of course, locating them in the transit served areas or places where we would expect people to have less cars will help all the better. But we don't yet see any kind of parking concern with those strategies of reducing those parking rates. I'll pause there for any questions on the R2 districts.
Colin?
So this looks like the path or the direction that you all were proposing with the help of, I'm sorry, who was the housing affordability consultant again?
Root Policy Research, I believe is her full name, but Root.
Root Research. Is this kind of the way that they're recommending that it goes? I know there's other discussions, but is this kind of what has been developed between them and you?
Yeah, I think they're advising on where you all are at, where you have gaps, and then what can be buildable. So they're kind of staying sort of neutral to what's the best building type for these districts. I think what they've always been key to saying is, yes, the numbers seem to work for this, and the developer interviews they have conducted would seem to show some interest in this. I think we got a question from the council on this the other night of like, well, some of these types are we just don't see them anymore. And that's kind of where that term, the missing middle, has come out, particularly the small apartment building. You don't see them being built new. They are, and their advice was, yes, those are the most difficult to be built for a number of reasons. But with these kind of changes, they are seeing in other areas, they've seen prototypes of that building type kind of being reintroduced. But it's certainly not going to happen anywhere and everywhere, and it's certainly a more challenging project than just going to find other large areas to do more conventional large scale multifamily apartment projects.
Bernie, can you come off mute, Bernie?
Yeah, sorry about that.
There you go. Okay.
Hey, quick question, two questions. Number one is, in me reading this chart for the R2 districts, are we suggesting that we're going to be allowing an accessory dwelling unit as part of a duplex structure as a use by right? Meaning, because right now I'm seeing, two principal for a duplex and one accessory. Is that per unit or is that per building? Because I think one of the things that I've always questioned and would love to see added is where we have the ability to build a duplex on, let's say, a standard 50 by 120 or 125 foot lot, is to allow for an accessory dwelling unit for each of the duplex units. In most cases, these would be located above the garage parking. So that's my first question.
Yeah, good question. That also probably points to the how the table needs to be clarified to that earlier point. So right now, I can say we were intending that to go with the building type. So, and the idea is the duplex and the multi-unit house should both be similarly scaled buildings in terms of appearing and looking like a larger home. And therefore, the one refers to, well, then there could be an outbuilding that has that unit. However, that one has not been updated consistent with what we did earlier above in those 2-unit houses. And then to your last point of we too are familiar with the ones where we've seen row houses with a detached garage, and then have, there might be 4 or 5 garages, and then the upper of those become smaller apartments as well. So we're familiar with those types. It just becomes a little bit difficult to pre-code those without, I think certainly a lot of those configurations would meet all of the standards that we have in for the MUR3 districts. So we are trying to be sensitive to making sure this is all still very neighborhood scale in the R2 districts. But your point is correct that some of those can be done, and they can be done well. So it's something we'll probably look at when we take a whole look at the accessory units as well. The other thing I would mention is if there's something particularly different or innovative that we're not anticipating, there's still other discretionary approvals we can look at to enable some of those as well.
Yeah, my point being is that, and I'm separating the duplex specifically from any multi-unit, meaning 3 or more, in that usually there's a lot reconfiguration that goes along with that. So it's a fee simple scenario where those garages are typically attached. So if we're going to allow an accessory dwelling unit on one, we probably need to allow it on both in a duplex scenario, because it's usually split ownership and legally a split lot scenario.
Yes, good point.
Chris, do you want to, and this is kind of one of the items I've mentioned to council before, is that I think we're going to go to a shift in the nomenclature in the city, and the duplexes based on these requirements and the definitions would be 2 units on 1 lot. Not what we've normally seen where people have subdivided and done 2 units on 2 separate lots.
Well, what would that be called then? Because I mean, now you're causing some confusion with what the building code, definitions of a duplex are.
And that's one of the things that I want to make sure we get clarified with all of this, because I've done work in multiple cities, and this was the first time I'd ever been anywhere where someone called a duplex 2 units on 2 separate lots. So to me, we caused the confusion here. So I just want to make sure we're clear. Whether we call it a duplex or whether we don't call it a duplex. Yeah, we've called it 2-unit townhomes before.
It's not a townhome. I mean, Denver, it's actually pretty consistent throughout the metro area. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that you're allowed to build 2 units on one owner, on one property ownership, as long as it meets the minimum requirements for width, size, and depth, etc.
Yeah, and I would say, right, the way we typically would address it is to be open to both, like as long as, and it will be a simple statement that both the row house building type and the duplex could either be owned as a investment property and rented. So you could own the whole thing and then you wouldn't have to plat the lots, or if they each individually meet these per lot standards, and that goes back to my point of why do we need the per unit minimums, it would be for that reason. If we want these to easily be flexed between all of them, it would be okay, if you plat them all separately, each of them needs to have this minimum, so you get that pattern that makes the building appear correct. But you can easily see that we do need to be clear on our terms and approaches in these areas here. It leads to that question we had with the multi-unit house of, well, why can't I individually own that? Well, our answer is, well, because that's a house and the units are stacked and configured all over. If you're setting them up in a row where they can easily be platted, that's a different building type. That's a row house. And so we'll want to clarify all of those points.
Yeah, I think keeping, just my opinion, I could be wrong on this, I think keeping the nomenclature as close to what it has been is going to be an easier conversation piece for both, those of us trying to navigate this, as well as communicating it to the public. My other thought / question is, has there been any consideration to having a table which is a use by right in all of these districts, and then a separate table which delves into the affordability bonuses or options, for lack of a better term. I think the affordability piece, I understand where that's coming from, and I understand why we're trying to tie these bonuses and missing middle pieces to that. I just think it's getting very well, for lack of a better term, it's confusing. And I think that it's part of why there's been so much discussion on this. I don't know. I would like to see it broken out, only because I think that would clarify things with people of, okay, here's where we stand, here's what you can do without the affordability piece, and then here are some of the options that plug into that, which might simplify things a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion. I think that's one of the directions we were thinking of heading, and that would really make the sort of the two-tiered adoption easy as well, because what we would really see is a table 16.5.1 immediately followed by a 16.5.2 that does that. So yeah, that's a good point.
Hey, Brenda.
Oh, good discussion. Do you think that, this question's for Chris, do you think that, well, maybe I just don't understand. I want to make sure I do. Do you think that the changes in R2A and B are substantive enough to maybe create an uptick in development in those areas and thereby kind of making the affordability thing mute? I mean, like no one would want to do that because of these changes.
Yeah, that's probably a question more for Root. I don't think it will necessarily, because the other thing you have to have is, so if you're in an area where, let's say there's already platted a couple of houses, though, that are established and viable, to get some of these other building types, you're almost going to have to get 2 of those lots in most cases. And I know that's happening, so you guys have experienced that. And what we're suggesting is these changes wouldn't increase that. If anything, they would allow that for smaller building types to occur. That perhaps could create an uptick, but I don't think, we haven't seen anything that says it's going to lead to wholesale changes in the neighborhoods. There was a second part of your question that was, and then how it impacts, would people not want to do affordability elsewhere? I think that is one of the goals of ours, is to, amongst all these districts, to diversify as much as we can. And it would be great if people were finding ways to do these types of units without taking advantage of the contractual obligation. So I think that would almost be a happy accident. And I think that's part of our bigger story, is we don't have to rely on just this idea of 2 to 4 unit buildings in R1 to move the needle, and move the needle probably pretty substantially of getting some different price points in the community.
Brenda, did you have another question?
No, I was just saying thank you. Very good.
Okay, thanks. That's it, Chris, for questions right now.
Yeah, and I think just to wrap that one up, I think we would defer to Root on some of the bigger picture implications of what some of these changes could be made. And that is one of the reasons we do want all of this tied to a housing policy, because these will be things that get evaluated over time as well. And so if we can get these patterns correct and these types correct, emphasizing or de-emphasizing one or the other could become simple code amendments based on an update to your housing policy going forward.
Okay, and then Colin's got his hand up.
Yeah, just real quick. I think we talked about having Root come in to one of these meetings. Is that still going to be the case?
Yes, we have them scheduled to come in April. I'll get the date before the end of this meeting. I'll let you know what the exact date was that we have them scheduled.
Great, thank you.
And then Carl came off mute.
Yeah, I just have a correction on your map. You had the Northern Creek in there labeled as Big Dry Creek, and it's actually Little Dry Creek.
Thank you for that.
just if you use that for your report, it's probably good.
Right. Yes, good point. So now that the MUR3 districts, again, some of these areas do have pretty rich detached house and low scale detached houses in them. However, they have been zoned for the 32, 40, and in some cases 60-foot building heights for the true multi-unit, what most people would say multifamily building types. And as I mentioned earlier, there's currently not necessarily a size, it's just the district setbacks, and however you fit within the resulting building envelope is where you end up. So for these districts, again, building on the theme, we want to encourage and allow all of those options to mix going forward. So everything that we've talked about previously would also be an important part of this district. If it's there, keeping it. If development occurs, we want development occur to mix it, although this district certainly has the largest potential for contrast next to each other. And that's true, I think, today as well. So the second bigger thing was to say, okay, now we're up to the districts where larger apartment buildings are planned for and expected. So we've drawn a distinction between the small apartment mixed use building between the MUR3A and then the B and C. Essentially what we did was we borrowed from the current standards of the MUR3B and C and said, let's bring the height limit down. So one of them allows up to 60 feet, but let's eliminate the per unit requirement. So in other words, if you're building one of these buildings, we are now assured what the building scale is, and let's allow however many units fit within that, and allow a mix of unit types. That's kind of the best strategy to get a range of housing even within a single building. The key being, as I mentioned earlier, parking is going to be where the constraint comes in. So again, getting to the overall benefits, we're allowing for potential smaller scale buildings to have more units in it. And we also have limits on where and how the larger scale buildings go that may not currently be as emphasized or evident as they are right now under the current code. And then that 40-foot height limit becomes key. That leads into the biggest affordability implications that Root's analysis came through is this is the one where a parking reduction and a height bonus really begins to make those buildings attractive. So bringing the market rate ones down to a 40-foot limit, potentially adding an additional story or up to 3 stories, depending on what level of affordability and how many of the units are provided at those price points, becomes a big leverage point for implementing affordable housing in those districts. The other thing I want to back up to, because it came out as a question in the council meeting, is that last bullet point down there on the benefits. So although these are targeted towards the MUR3B districts, which going back to the map, they're not very large areas. However, they could also be, we're also talking about your business districts and your medical districts allow mixed use as well. So these building types and housing can be a very large component of those districts as well. And then also subject to those same affordability bonuses based on the affordable housing policy.
Okay, yeah, sorry, we've got a couple questions if that's okay. Michelle?
Yes, and this might be a question more for Brian, but we recently planning and zoning has over the course of the last year or so, excuse me, approved some buildings that are multiple unit housing. And do you know off the top of your head if Brian or even Chris, if you're that familiar with what we've done here in the city recently, do these limits that you're talking about here for these zoning districts, have those been exceeded in any of the PUDs that we approved or not?
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think it's something we could certainly find out because it's a really good point.
Yeah, not, of course, not the affordability part, but the the
Right.
height and all that stuff.
I don't know right off the top of my head either. We can look into it. I do know with all the parking, we sent Chris and his team, you know, all the parking requirements for some of the recently approved PUDs. And then some of the studies that we've done, TOD studies that we've done to talk about the numbers. So we have sent them that. Anything about the height, I'll have to look into.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Andy?
So the additional bonus that would be negotiable through the PUD process, would that require any changes to the criteria that decision is based on?
Right now, our approach in the draft, and we will circle back to it once we kind of round out these discussions with council and get with Root, is most of the bonuses will be pre-codified. So to that earlier point, we want the code to say, if you provide this many at this price point, you get one additional story and this parking reduction. If you provide this many, you may get a second additional story and this parking reduction. So those things will be built in. That last bullet point is to say, well, if someone came in with a, you know, Root calls them mission-driven developers. If they come in with something that's just off the scale of any of those pre-codified ones, then those bonuses could be negotiated through the PUD. But we do want some very viable options pre-coded into this, and that will be, if you go back to the drafts, you can kind of see our first approach that's based off of kind of our late December, January information, and I believe it's section 16.5.6, where we start to add in the affordability bonuses. So that will be the provision that, one, needs to get updated based on these building types, and then two would be the basis for kind of a second table on, you know, what's allowed by right versus what's allowed by the parking, or I mean the affordability incentives.
Colin?
So you touched on it, and I guess I kind of realized not all of our zoning is on here. So what about the medical units and I mean the other one that had it up
Yeah.
there, but yeah.
So based on the question we had at council, I kind of went back and did some checking, and I may be a little bit out of school, because I know in our staff meeting we were talking about this as well. They're currently allowed right now in those districts, except there's a provision, a small provision in your code that says on certain blocks along Broadway, I think it's 3300 through 3500, in the MUB2 district, they have to be mixed use buildings. There's two potential ways when you just read that simple sentence, there's two potential ways to interpret it. Is it only in those areas, or is it everything except those areas? I think I know what the answer is, but we're discussing that with staff. But the overall direction is we need to be more open to mixed use. If it's a mixed use building type, it's going to be allowed anyway. So they will be allowed to build these apartments and multi-unit buildings on top of it in most cases, without a density requirement. And that's true today. So these bonuses will be eligible for that as well in those districts. So that begins to start to make a really good transition between these zoning districts. And it also begins to open up a lot of potential areas where affordability components can be mixed into the community in areas that are already zoned for larger scale buildings. Those two districts, by the way, both the M and the MUB have two different height limits right now, 60 and 100 feet. Kind of getting ahead into some of the design issues that we haven't really focused on for this meeting, but they're still the same or similar to what we've discussed previously. Those building types currently don't have any scale or massing standards, and so we're proposing, and that's true in these MU districts as well, we're proposing a step back requirement at the 30, I believe the 24-foot height limit. There becomes an 8-foot step back. If it goes up to above 40, there would become a 12-foot step back. So to try and create a reasonable scale at the street level, most of these buildings will become street front buildings, and then allow the higher parts to be more internal to the block and lot. So that's a new standard. It's not the bulk plane, but for these buildings that are clearly multi-unit, multi-story buildings, it seems to be an appropriate strategy as well.
Brenda?
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I understand. You said they would be, let's just say if I wanted to do this is on a row house, a small lot, where you have a 16,000 K or 16K total mass. But let's say I go ahead and do the AMI bonus. Does that kick my total mass up to 20,000 then? Even though I'm a small road house, small lot, if I do the affordability, can I build something taller even though I'm on a small lot? You get what I'm saying?
Yes,
Like
I
this
do.
already come down. Okay.
Right. That's a good question and something that we'll clarify through the actual standards. So the height bonus, we talked about this with Root as well. Some of the building types, the height bonus doesn't really do them that much because they don't generally go taller. So it's really only going to be the apartment building types that where the units could be configured in kind of any number of different ways that height bonus benefits. So a row house where the unit is ground to roof, that building type doesn't benefit that much from an added story. Because it's going to be a single unit all the way up. Now there are configurations of buildings called stacked row houses or different things, but we would then lump those into, well, that becomes a small apartment or mixed use building. So usually the height bonuses are only going to kick in these areas right down here. We wouldn't see them working for these more neighborhood scale ones that you see in the R2 districts.
And Andy?
Yeah, I was going to go back to the point about the MUB districts. I know that the ground floor commercial requirement has made some of those difficult to park, and on the Board of Adjustment and Appeals, we tend to get variances periodically for folks who really want to add residential in those districts, but it's just practically impossible with that. Would some of these parking reduction possibilities carry over to the commercial component if that's still going to be required in some of those MUB districts?
Not the affordability ones we're talking about. I think on the commercial ones, we're looking to other options to bring down that parking requirement. So the transit area credit, the on-street parking allowance for commercial uses, and those types of things where we're trying to bring that down. Shared parking, obviously, as well. But I don't, it's a question I'll go back to Root with on whether the affordability bonus could carry over into a reduction for the commercial. I think the one thing that jumps to my mind immediately is they might become eligible right away for a shared parking agreement. We have a default matrix in there that says if you have this different configuration of uses, you can bring your parking rate down. However, saying that if the residential component isn't providing any anyway, that it might eat up that shared parking reduction a little bit. But that's a good question. I'll try to follow up on that with Root.
Okay, you're good to go.
All right. So that kind of concludes the ones that we kind of feel like we have solid direction on. I'm sorry, I forgot one more mention. We talked about this last time as well. I brought this up earlier with the modular. So you currently have a manufactured home community standards that are in your code, and they're only allowed in the I district. Last time we discussed the option of, hey, let's expand that and make it available for a range of small format housing. So essentially this would be that courtyard pattern that we've talked about, but larger than that. So projects that exceed the limits of how we would arrange a typical courtyard pattern of smaller format housing. How would you do an entire project of that? So think of your typical, what people might call mobile home park or trailer park, but improved for more innovative development options, tiny homes, modular homes. And so our strategy is let's raise the community design standards for those areas, but also make them more viable projects for investment and reinvestment. So the direction was to, we first started when we last were with this committee of well, it's allowed right now in the I districts, so let's just keep that going on. So then there was direction to, well, why not allow it in MU districts already planned for multi-unit projects? Essentially what these become is sort of detached multi-family or multi-unit projects. So in other words, someone just took the 20 or 30 or 40 units they were allowed and laid them out in a more of a kind of campus or some kind of planned layout on the ground rather than in one building. So we think there could be some options, just another option to add. We can't say that anyone's going to gravitate to it. We can't say that this will lead to immediate redevelopment of your existing manufactured home parks, which you have some in the I districts. But at least there is an opportunity to allow you to be open to those. The current code had impediments to that. In other words, it had a really low density requirement and a really high project threshold. So a minimum of 8 acres and then a maximum of 8 dwelling units per acre. Staff looked at your existing areas where those projects are built, and even those don't meet it. So to make it more viable, the direction was to bring the project threshold down to a minimum of 2 acres to do a project like this, and then a maximum of 14 dwelling units per acre. Essentially what that equates to, when you factor out the common areas that lead to circulation of the buildings and circulation to and among the buildings, it equates to about a 1,000 to 2,500 square foot home site. So lots smaller than the smallest one we're enabling here, but that next tier down of building types. And so allowing those through some type of planned project, there would need to be a development plan associated with them. They wouldn't necessarily just be by right, but allowing someone to propose a development plan that arranges those is what we're exploring.
Okay, no more questions yet.
All right. With that, it now circles back to the big issue that's drawing all the attention, is this concept of, okay, let's take our R1 districts and let's go even further and let's allow 2 to 4 unit building types in these districts. And again, the idea is if it's scaled and appears similar to a house and similar to the types of development we're enabling, why not have 2, 3, or 4 units in it? Slightly different from the accessory dwellings we talked about before. These would all be principal dwelling units. So there would not necessarily be one that's the principal and others that are the subordinate. These would all be units in their own right. So one of the first thing we broached was with council was, okay, we need to be cautious. There's a building envelope that's reflected in this bulk plane, and we might expect some of these outcomes if we don't address them in another way. So we got direction from them. No, they're only interested in exploring this if we can reduce the scale of the building so it is more house appearing, both in terms of scale and massing, and also the cosmetics of doors, entry features, and those types of things. So that tells us that we need to go back to the bulk plane. I think it was brought up in public comment that there was some discussion of that at the last council meeting. We as staff had kind of already been going along the path of perhaps there needs to really just be one bulk plane. You currently have 2, one that's starts at 12 feet for the R1 A and B districts, another one that starts at 17 feet for the R1C and the R2 districts, and they only apply to 1 to 4 unit buildings. So if I were to go into one of those districts where a more than 4 unit building is allowed in the R2 district, there's no bulk plan at all. So the larger the building, the less restraints you have. So what we've been discussing with staff is that 12-foot bulk plane really ought to be the one that applies to the things that we're intending to appear scaled to a house. And then the 5+ unit buildings would go by that step back approach we mentioned earlier. And that's mainly because of this direction that council would prefer to see them the buildings coming out more like this than some of these other building types that you see over here. The other reminder to this that I mentioned earlier is, remember that in R1, we've already enabled these potential options that can get you to 2, 3, and maybe even in some configurations, 4 dwelling units that will be smaller scale buildings that could fit into the neighborhood. And so with that, in the R1 districts, again, refreshing everyone's mind of where those are, these are the options we laid out to discuss. And this is what we ticked through with council, and this is what's not appearing in the table right now, and which would probably be benefit from all the affordability units moving to a second table, as was discussed. First requirement is this is only happening to someone who agrees to contractually bind themselves to providing an affordable unit based on the housing policy. We got confirmation that these in the R1 districts, these are location limited. However, some of the options they threw back at us began to question whether that's just the right strategy or not. So they were looking at 3 things to kind of keep in mind here. One is some of them, and we had alliances of not consensus on any of these, I think is where we're at. But the idea that location limited provided some predictability to here's where they can go, and we know that's a given, and we put that in the code. Others thought, well, we don't want every single corner to all of a sudden blow up, so why don't we, and to be picking the I think the term that was used was winners and losers. In our mind, it's being done based on a planning policy and strategy and a pattern that exists in your community, so it's a legitimate approach. But there was at least the concern of, well, what if we just did 1 per block, or what if we only did 1 in every 3-year period, or something like that, that moderated how this occurred over time. That, of course, brought up a lot of questions that we need to go back to the law department on to figure out, okay, which of these strategies are viable, which of these strategies would bring up legal concerns on how and what specific techniques we do. But at least those ideas of filtering and moderating this are out there. When you get to C, there was a consensus that, well, if we're doing this, we should certainly allow the row home if it's limited to 4 units per building. And we've gone even further and suggested we think it should be limited to 2-story row home as well, and then oriented towards the end of the block. The benefit, for even though that building type doesn't have the appearance of a house, it can be a smaller scale based on the standards. And it's also one that's more easily owner occupied. And so with owner occupancy of affordable units being an important policy direction of the city, we think that's a viable strategy. And then D was really looking at how do we use these districts to kind of really hone in how and where we would want to explore this option of 2 to 4 unit buildings in R1 districts, or if we want to do it at all. And so that's where the discussion of let's break this issue out into a separate approval when we do come back with the full code was the direction we got when we last met.
Kate. Oh, sorry, Chris.
No, I'm rambled on enough.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this in the sense of if you have a 6,000 square foot lot in an R1A or a 7,200 square foot lot in an R1A, you're not allowed to build a single family home, but you are potentially, if you have a corner lot, allowed to build 2 to 4 units if it's affordable. I just don't understand why we're not allowing then single family homes on 6,000 square foot lots and 7,200 square foot lots in R1A.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. I think this gap you're seeing here is more of a legacy of our original approach and us trying to stay as true as we could to your current zoning districts. But you're exactly right. If these start to fill in, I think it would cause us to go back and then fill this in, much the way we did with the smaller lots as well. Those kind of tiered to your current code as well. And the more we look at things down in here, the more those should fill in. So you have a good point, and we'll look at that.
And Colin?
I think one of the challenges that I see with the affordable implementation is then the tracking of it and making sure that they stay in that, and how is that going to be coded? How would that be coded in? Would that be in this in the UDC also? Is that something that would have to be implemented within the city separately? Is there? I'm sure there's been consideration of that, but how is that all going to work?
Yeah, I think the coding part is actually the easier challenge for once, so I get to have the easy job. We'll be relying on Root and then getting with staff on, okay, how do we track this? How do we administratively keep the records? We've been in just kind of the brief conversations. We think I've understood, and Brian, you might know even more specifics. It's not an insurmountable challenge. It certainly is an administrative task that needs to be done. We certainly have to have the contractual obligations in place and ready for this. So there's a lot of follow-up work based on where the code lands that will need to back the code and be ready should someone else choose this option.
Aaron?
I was going to make a comment on Collins. It would likely follow, I think Chris mentioned this earlier, that we have the UDC portion, and then there's likely going to be a larger housing policy discussion. And that's where you would probably see, the administrative side of how we do things tied in more there. We are trying to remove like administrative policies and procedures out of code because they do fluctuate from time to time, and it's very difficult to change them if they're in the UDC. But yeah, it would likely follow follow up with the larger housing policy discussion.
And is that policy, how does that become enforceable? I guess, is that just the policy then and not?
No. If there's a larger housing policy discussion, meaning like a housing policy or housing approach, typically that would come through council for some form of approval, whether it's a resolution or an ordinance. I don't know what it looks like right now, but that's how it becomes enforceable, as we bring it back to council for some form of approval.
And the code would reference that policy, right? My question, my first question was about, we're blurring the lines between R1 and R2. What are the other ways, and I know there's some listed here, that we're still prioritizing these type of projects in R2? You had mentioned earlier, Chris, that a lot of our R2 is underdeveloped and pretty sparse. So just curious about what we're doing, and if we're blurring those lines, how do we still direct some of these denser projects to R2 where they haven't been done in the past? Yeah, that's a great question. So we put this together just for some perspective on that. It would be hard to predict from our standpoint of, what we're enabling, because I do think we're enabling, to that question earlier, of will the R2 A and B districts change? We've certainly have reduced a couple of barriers to make the projects easier. I think when we've done that, we've done things to also make sure they're actually smaller scale rather than larger scale. But what impact that can have might be tough to say. But just by order of magnitude, when we're looking at just the corner lots, you see the numbers here of how many there are. And this is data that Ayers put together as a part of our team effort. And then you look at the total lots in R2A and B that are already zoned for these types. Really right now, and we're kind of just tweaking them for what's allowed by right, regardless of affordability. And we're getting to comparable numbers, if not even more in the R2, even though it's a more limited area. How many of those, whether the ownership patterns, configurations, existing building conditions, and those type of things are ripe to make that developable is a little bit tough to say. And then what we aren't showing here is what we discussed in the MUR3 and the I think in the MUB and M districts. Those might be areas where, you might have underutilized commercial buildings with a large parking lot that are the easier ones to develop at an even higher threshold. So I think we're kind of attacking it on multiple levels among all of these districts. And the last question is, does this additional item, does this help? And some people feel like, well, yes, it helps because we should throw everything we have at this issue. And if we do it in a logical, planned and strategic way, that's smart. Other people, disagree with that, obviously. But I think there's enough here to say we're pushing on multiple different levels of this. I think that's an important part of the story to tell. I mean, obviously there's a contingent, that was at the last board meeting and every board, every meeting. And
just to tell that side of the story as well, not just that it's only impacting R1 and, you know, yeah, that's all I'll say on that. I think they need to hear that as well.
And Chris, did you touch on it? I'm sorry, I was a little distracted. Did you touch on that? Some of the items that may be location sensitive in R1A, B, and C are allowed by right in R2B, or, you know, they're permitted, so it makes them a little bit more viable in certain areas. So
Yes, right. Yeah, that was the nature of the question and observation. Yeah.
Hey,
And so we
Noel,
have been discussing that at staff.
sorry. Noel?
In terms of potentially restricting the number of some of these options, you know, to either a geographic or a certain, you know, interval between them. I remember Boulder's ADU policy having a geographic aspect to it. So that might be one to look at in terms of whether that worked out or didn't work out. And then in the for those corner lots, I you know, always hate to bring up height because that seems to be always a topic. I'm not sure if we're going into it a little later, but I'd be curious what, you know, the public thinks if we're saying, hey, 4 lots on this corner, but they can only be 14 feet tall, making up that number. You know, what do people think about that? Because I know I only ever hear complaints about height in terms of new houses going up.
Yeah, that was discussed at the council meeting. In fact, there was a photo example of a single story 2 or 3 unit building, and it was, I think everyone was, you know, thought, yeah, that one wouldn't be as big a concern. We always hesitate on, we kind of start with where you're at, right? In most cases. So the R1A and B and C all currently have a 32-foot height limit right now. So backing down on that sometimes can be difficult. However, we've done it in strategic places. So I mentioned earlier on the smaller lots, if we're going to be promoting these and allowing these, let's bring the height limit down to ensure that it's a small scale building. So maybe that's also part of the strategy on the 2 to 4 unit building opt-in. You know, yes, you're agreeing to contractually agreeing to provide affordable unit. Are there things we could put on the size and scale that may not otherwise be applied to a detached house? I think the difficulty we would run into there, and Root has brought this up, is we still want to make sure those are viable buildings. So what we wouldn't want to do is give the really large home an advantage over the smaller scale 4 unit affordable housing project. We wouldn't want to create an imbalance there, that it's actually an incentive to build the larger one. But I think you're bringing up some good points that need to be considered. I thought there was another point, but it's escaping my mind right now, so maybe it'll come to me later.
Paula?
You go back to the bulk plane image, and I just kind of, yeah. So I think what we're saying right now is any one of those ones on the right are within the current bulk plane. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. What we tried to do was to set up one that, you know, most people would recognize as a house scaled building, even though it has multiple units. Show one that maybe currently can be built under your 17-foot bulk plane, and you're seeing some of these types, and then one that would fit under the bulk plane but has a more of a apartment looking look. It's clearly a multi-unit building, to kind of test what people's goals are in terms of the building type and aesthetics.
So even though I think you were saying people are kind of going to the middle, or to the middle lower one, or the ones on the far left are of what they prefer, theoretically any one of those upper 3 could be built, although the top one, just you couldn't build that whole thing like under the tent there, could you?
No, you could not. That's correct.
Yeah.
That's just reflecting where buildings could potentially go, but other standards would limit you from building out the whole thing.
But you could do the 2 on the top or the far right.
We believe so. We've kind of, it might not be exacting, but we believe so. And then that's also what I mentioned, that's leading us to, we need to go to one bulk plan for the house scale buildings, regardless of which district they're in. And then we also need to look at some of the design standards that go along with the 1 to 4 unit buildings regarding the massing, entry features and things that can limit this lower scale building from happening. That being said, to the earlier point, these are all appropriate and reasonable R2 buildings, and they would meet the R2 standards.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions right now.
That sort of concludes our update of where council's at. So I think just to kind of sum up, we think we have direction both from you all and the council on 1 through 7, and 8 is still the bigger question out there that they will circle back to. I think we've heard some good observations tonight. I don't know if there's any other things that we're missing or things people feel we need to carry that message forward, but that was all I had.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Christine has a question, and then Kate.
Hi. I was wondering if you could go back to the smaller modular type campus type situation that would be allowed in the I districts, and how you came up with those particular size ranges of 14 dwelling units per acre. And I'm wondering if it might be possible to fit in more smaller units, even more than you had adjusted here. Or if you could walk through those calculations a little bit.
Yeah, so it's nothing exacting by any means. So I think it's a combination of we've done some where we laid any of these types of projects, you can usually assume that and especially the larger it is. So the 2 acre ones, maybe not as much, but you can easily factor out anywhere from 20 to 30% as those community spaces and circulation. So that leaves a certain number of property left. And then when you take a home site, typically on a more, well, I'll jump to a slide we looked at on a previous presentation that I have kind of hidden back here. When we first brought this issue up. So these, so when you take some of those home sites and other versions, you're usually dealing with anywhere from a 14 by 35 to 14 by 60 building in the elongated pattern, or something that's a 20 to 25 by 20 to 25 building type. And then when we do the building separation, we're usually in about a 900 square feet to 15 or maybe upwards of 2,000 square foot home site on each of those. So that gets you a certain number. The other place the number came from, I think, is staff did some counting on the current manufactured home parks that you have. And I believe that one might be more directly related to the 14. But if the question is, could it fit more? We can look at that. It probably can. I think the other thing about how we envision that being enabled is it will be a planned designation district. So someone needs to submit a development plan based on, similar to borrowing off your current PUD approach, which we'll be modifying. So there might be some flexibility that we could build into that number as well. So we'll be taking a look at that as well.
Thanks. It kind of sounds like this is an opportunity for maybe a developer who wants to be a little bit more creative. And I could see potentially some smaller sizes than 1,000 square feet, 900 square feet, maybe 600 to 800 square feet, or something that might be really nice for a young single person or a retired person living alone that still wants to be near their family in Inglewood or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other way we tend to think about this is, if you remember, we are enabling in the development code, particularly with the small lots that are in our overall table, the courtyard pattern, which I think I have a slide on that from our previous presentations as well. I'm not finding it readily. Anyway, the smaller lots, that is particularly the 2.5 and the 4,000 square foot lot, those are ones that we would see viable for maybe an internal block reorientation of anywhere from 4 to 8 buildings that could probably fit on, by our math, maybe 2 to 3 lots. So there's a way to get the lot number down there that will be built into the code. These projects that we're talking about are simply A, larger scale projects, so they're not a courtyard, but maybe multiple courtyards. And B, you're right, they might be even dealing with smaller format housing than we're even building into your current detached house standards. So those numbers aren't fixed and hard and fast yet, I guess is a way to round out that conversation.
Okay, Kate.
I was just curious. I was looking at Walla Walla's code updates from Walla Walla, Washington, and which is a similar size community.
Am I the only one who lost Kate?
Kate, if you can hear us, you've frozen.
Just because I like to hear Walla Walla.
Yeah, the really good onions in Walla Walla.
Kate, sorry, you're still frozen if you can hear us. I'll watch for her and bring her back in when she comes in. I don't currently have any other questions at the moment. But we can wait for Kate here, hopefully.
I've got a question if we're just waiting.
Oh,
I wanted to, sorry.
No, go ahead. And then Christine, I'll get to you after Noel.
I wanted to confirm when we're talking about detached versus attached ADUs and sizes, if I have a detached and an attached on a lot that fits it, does the sum of those two have to equal the 800 square feet in what you're proposing?
No, in our conception of it, that would be a limit for each unit. Obviously, there's another example of the smaller the lot, the more it might not be possible to hit the max on each of those. So if you're providing 2, you're probably going to be pushing the max of your lot coverage, your accessory building size, which is limited. So it could become tighter and tighter, and it's probably more likely that neither of them would be that large. But at least as a concept, and on an R1A lot, you're more likely to be able to get 2 800-foot ones. But at least to keep it simple and to keep it in line with what we typically might see in an ADU, the idea was, well, let's keep it at 800 per unit. It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, if this committee or planning commission or where it feels differently, we can take it in a different direction. And just for information's sake, the size of ADUs in terms of floor area, we typically see a studio or 1 bedroom in the about 350 to 400 square feet. Obviously, a larger one could go over and a really smaller one could go below. We typically would see a 1 bedroom in about the 500 to 650 square feet, and you might see a large 1 bedroom or a 2 bedroom upwards of 800. There was some direction at council to set the number at 15% of the lot for a detached building, or even 1,500 square feet for a building. our opinion is that's just too large, particularly when we're talking about a floor area of a unit.
Christine, are you okay? Kate is now back in the meeting. Are you okay if I go to Kate?
Yeah.
Okay, and I am gonna, thank you. Kate, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I might turn my video off but so yeah, I was looking at Walla Walla, Washington's code. They have a similar size community. They looked at a lot of their residential zone districts and ended up creating a neighborhood residential zone, which encompasses several different types of zoning or different types of residential zones. Because so many of our dimensional requirements are similar across like R1A through R1C and somewhat into the R2s. I didn't know if that was something that either Chris, you've looked at, our staff or root policy to see, is there a way to look at a model like that in terms of simplifying? Because these charts are great, but it is very complex as well.
Yeah, no, great question. And we're hitting the point where we're like to a lot of the questions that were asked, even about, well, some of this is legacy from, keeping the current approach and trying to start in all of these districts with where we're at. In other words, let's not inject wholesale changes on areas that are already zoned, but let's be strategic about it. When we get to the end and circle back, we can certainly take a look at it. One of the original questions we asked was that this is a lot of zoning districts for a community your size of residential. However, these are all mixed use as well, so there's a lot going on in these districts, and there are some differences between them that aren't appearing in this table that we would want to be protective of. But to your bigger point, you can already see we've almost erased entirely the distinction in MUR 3, B, and C. So do those need to be combined? The more we blur these single family types up here, do the R1 districts need to be combined? So it's certainly possible. We're kind of waiting to the last to try and determine that. So from the code going forward, there will be opportunities. I will say we were surprised at how beneficial some of these distinctions were for the discussions we're having, because again, we started from the point of this is a lot of zoning districts for your area. We may end up to where we start to see like, hey, logically, we've blurred these, so let's combine them and simplify. We're always big fans of simplifying. The second part of that, though, is it will create a mapping and logistic challenge that we need to work with staff and the legal department going forward. Usually that's done in a code update to where, hey, if you were, let's say we combined R1, B, and C. R1, B, and C now become R1B. That would be the approach we would take to that, and have a conversion provision in the code itself that creates that. However, we'd want to make sure we're in step with how the law department views that as well, because there certainly are technical and mapping logistics with that as too.
Okay, Christine, thank you so much. You can go ahead.
Sure. Chris, could you review for me where really small, say 300 square foot studios would or would not be allowed, whether that's an apartment or an ADU?
Yes. Okay. So certainly that would be right in line with the typical ADU size. So all of the R1 districts would be able to have one of those as an ADU, and in some cases, perhaps two of those. The second place we would start to see them come in would be this small apartment building, because we've gotten out of the just pure multi-unit building types. You could start to see those, and in most cases they would probably be mixed in with a unit mix. So you might have 2 or 3 studios of that size, maybe a couple 1 bedrooms and a couple 2 bedrooms would fill out this building type. And then the place where you're probably most likely to see it would be in the larger apartment buildings, because there is not a per unit minimum, and you could be as efficient as you needed to be to address the market for those building types. So I think that we could see that. And the other part about the ADUs that was mentioned earlier is we are starting to look at combining them with these other multi-unit buildings as well. So the house scale buildings can get one aspect of it. The apartment scale buildings would get another aspect of it. So we think we've got options for it in all 3 zoning districts.
Perfect. That sounds great.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything else. Brian?
No, I don't have anything else to add other than question Colin asked earlier about route policy. We have Molly Fitzpatrick scheduled to come visit this committee on April 18th. That was the only other thing that I had.
Oh, Bernie's got a question.
Yeah, as far as having the latest and greatest of what we're presenting and what City Council's been reviewing, do we have that? Do we have that access to everything, that the current versions of this for our review?
Yeah, I'll start, and Brian, you can fill in. As I understand, after our last meeting, the latest drafts were made available to you all in a comprehensive set. Now that doesn't have a lot of the nuance we've just covered in this presentation. I guess for lack of a better vessel for it, this presentation is the latest and greatest because that's what council has been reviewing as well. And our reason for that is we don't want to go issue another draft or make changes until we have landed on a solid directions on some of these things. So we are tracking it all. And I guess the other thing I would say is we do know we're going back to council one more time at a work session, and we will try to consolidate that into, if not a revised draft, at least an updated memo that probably ought to be distributed to you all as well. But it would essentially summarize all the things we've discussed tonight.
And all those latest drafts are in the Inglewood Engaged page. And then any of the updates or study sessions that we get from council, we link the videos to that page too, along with the presentations. You'll have access to the handouts. And we also send those links, which reminds me, I need to send you all, make sure we sent you all the link to last week's video tomorrow.
Carl, go ahead.
Just curious, is there on the corner fourplexes, is there, you have a count on the number of corners. Is there a count on the vacant corner lots?
I believe we have that count. I'll have to check with Matt Ashby of Ayers, who's been working with us. He's been doing some of the GIS mapping. I think we do have that. I'm not sure if it was from GIS data or if it was just observational. I think the other part of it is the answer is probably not many. I don't think you have that many vacant lots, period. But I would be surprised if it's a large number, but we can try and find out that information for you.
Good, thank you.
Colin?
I don't think that would be restricted to just a vacant lot, though, just as a clarification. I mean, it could be a tear down at that point to do that. So I think the consideration of all of the lots is something that we'd want to make sure that we are considering and make sure that we understand the impact of that.
Right.
My point is the vacant lots would be the first ones to go. They would be jumping on this immediately.
Okay, Chris, did you have anything else?
I did not. I just appreciate everyone's time and the good questions and observations that are helping make this a better project.
Great. Back to you, Brian.
I don't have anything else. I just appreciate everybody's time and input on this project. And again, if you've got any questions, please reach out to me. Or if you've sent any comments previously, please make sure and send them again to make sure that we have them all. I think Mr. Taylor sent me some today, and I appreciate that very much. So yeah, thank you for your input, and we'll continue to bring
Now
guess I
we've got,
started some
now we've got
questions.
more questions. Colin and then Michelle.
Yeah, there was a note of somebody had said they sent questions in at the beginning of the meeting. Are
That's
those?
Colin, that's exactly what I was gonna ask
Okay.
about. Yeah.
Yes, we
Yes.
got a list of questions this morning to our community development email. And I don't know that it was requested that we answer them tonight. We're working on responses to that citizen, so we will get them out as soon as we can.
Do we get copied on that, or can we maybe get an update of what those questions were and what the responses are? Maybe the next meeting. I don't think we need it tonight, but yeah.
Yeah, we can present that in the next meeting if that's what you want.
I'd like to know it. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm. All right. Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a great night.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Discussion. Thanks, Chris.